And suddenly the sky around his Messerschmitt erupted into a hell of tracer rounds and armor-piercing incendiary bullets that streamed past his canopy in glowing ribbons of death. Far more fire than any single fortress should have been able to generate, and Hartmann instinctively broke left, pulling his stick back hard and feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat as his fighter clawed for altitude, and he heard his wingman Werner screaming over the radio that he was hit, that his engine was on fire, and through his rearview mirror Hartmann caught a glimpse of Werner's 109 trailing smoke as it fell away from the formation. But there was no time to mourn because two more Messerschmitts from his squadron were already engaging the bomber stream, and Hartmann could see them taking hits, could see pieces of wing and fuselage tearing away as the American gunners found their range, and he realized with a cold shock that this was not going to be another easy slaughter of helpless bombers, that something fundamental had changed in the air war over Germany, and as he climbed back to attack altitude and surveyed the bomber stream with new respect, he understood that the Americans had learned from their early disasters, had studied their losses and adapted their tactics, had transformed their individual flying coffins into a unified defensive system where each bomber's vulnerability became negligible when multiplied by the collective firepower of an entire formation. And the laugh that had been so easy minutes ago now caught in his throat as he watched 6 more Messerschmitts from neighboring squadrons flash into the bomber stream only to emerge trailing smoke or not emerge at all, their pilot's confidence turned against them by the same contempt that Hartmann himself had felt, and he remembered suddenly what his old instructor had told him during training in 1940, that the most dangerous moment in combat comes when you believe you have already won, and now Hartmann approached the fortress formation with something approaching caution, studying the geometry of their defensive box, looking for gaps that might not exist, trying to reconcile the intelligence reports that had dismissed these bombers as obsolete death traps with the evidence of his own eyes, watching 3 more German fighters cartwheeling earthward wrapped in flame, and he selected a target on the edge of the formation, a fortress that had already taken damage and was struggling to maintain position, its number 3 engine feathered and trailing a thin stream of coolant vapor, and Hartmann dove again, this time approaching from below and behind at an angle that should minimize his exposure to the overlapping gun positions, his finger tensing on the firing stud as he closed to 400 meters, 300, 200, and then the American gunners found him, and the tail gunner in his target opened fire simultaneously with the ball turret gunner from the fortress above. And, suddenly, the Luftwaffe ace Klaus Hartmann had already painted 43 kill markers on the fuselage of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 when he first encountered the ungainly American bombers limping through the crystalline sky over Bremen on that bitter December morning in 1943, and as he banked his fighter into position alongside his wingmen, watching the massive 4-engine formations struggling to maintain altitude with their ridiculous lack of maneuverability, he keyed his radio and laughed. Actually, laughed at the sight of these flying warehouses that the Americans had somehow convinced themselves could survive in contested airspace, these lumbering B-17 flying fortresses that his fellow pilots had already nicknamed Die Fliegenden Särge, the flying coffins, because surely only madmen or the desperately ignorant would climb into such slow, cumbersome machines and expect to return home alive, and as Hartmann rolled his nimble 109 into an attack dive, watching his wingmen peel off to strike from different angles in the coordinated assault patterns they had perfected through hundreds of sorties, he felt the familiar surge of predatory confidence that came from knowing his aircraft could outclimb, outrun, and outturn anything the Americans had managed to drag across the Atlantic. The same contemptuous certainty that had spread through every Luftwaffe squadron from Norway to Italy as they studied intelligence photographs of these American bombers with their flat-sided fuselages that presented perfect target profiles, their inadequate defensive armament concentrated in hand-operated gun positions that created blind spots a competent fighter pilot could exploit with ease, their pitiful cruise speed that made them sitting ducks for German fighters that could strike, escape, rearm, and strike again before the bomber formations had traveled another 10 kilometers, and Hartmann had personally sent 7 of these flying coffins spiraling earthward in the past 3 weeks alone, had watched American crew members tumbling through the air when their parachutes failed to deploy in time, had seen the distinctive pattern of debris that marked where another fortress had come apart under the concentrated cannon fire that his unit delivered with surgical precision. But on this particular morning something was different, something that Hartmann noticed only when he had closed to within 800 meters and prepared to fire, when he saw that these fortresses were not scattered in the loose defensive formations that characterized earlier American raids but were instead flying in tight combat boxes, each group of bombers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that would force attacking fighters to run a gauntlet of 50-caliber machine gun fire from multiple aircraft simultaneously. And even as this tactical adjustment registered in his combat-sharpened mind, even as he began to calculate new approach angles that might minimize his exposure, the lead fortress open. Hartmann's cockpit exploded into chaos as a 50-caliber round punched through his canopy and ricocheted off his instrument panel, showering his face with fragments of metal and glass, and he fired wildly as he broke away, not knowing if his cannon shells had found their target, pulling 7 Gs in a desperate climbing turn that made his vision narrow to a tunnel, and when he leveled out and could see clearly again, he counted his squadron and found that of the 12 Messerschmitts that had begun this attack, only 7 remained combat-capable, and they had managed to shoot down exactly 2 bombers while the rest of the American formation continued inexorably toward their target. Bleeding from a dozen wounds but still flying, still fighting, and for the first time in 3 years of combat Hartmann felt something that might have been fear, or perhaps just the cold understanding that the easy victories were over, that the Americans had finally learned how to use their fortresses. Effectively, that the laughing would stop now because the war in the air had fundamentally changed. But the true shock came 6 weeks later when Hartmann encountered his first formation of B-17s escorted by the new American P-51 Mustang fighters. Those sleek long-range escorts that the Luftwaffe High Command had assured them were mythical, that could not possibly exist because the laws of physics dictated that no single-engine fighter could carry enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, except there they were, those silvery Mustangs with their distinctive bubble canopies and laminar flow wings, weaving through the bomber formations like hunting sharks. And when Hartmann tried to exploit the old tactic of striking the bombers and then escaping using his superior speed, a Mustang materialized on his 6 o'clock with impossible quickness and nearly shot him out of the sky before he managed to dive away into cloud cover. His hands shaking on the stick, his mind reeling with the realization that the Americans had not only solved the problem of bomber defensive tactics but had also managed to extend fighter protection across the entire depth of German airspace. And back at base that evening, as the pilots gathered in the ready room and counted their losses, 18 aircraft failed to return, including 4 of Hartmann's closest friends. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was making jokes about flying coffins, because the coffins were now filled with German pilots, who had underestimated their enemy once too often, and Hartmann stood at the window watching the sun set over the airfield and thought about the bomber crews he had fought that morning, thought about the Americans who had died in the fortresses he had destroyed over the past months, and he realized that those crews had never been flying death traps at all, that they had been brave men doing an impossible job with inadequate equipment until their commanders figured out how to use that equipment properly, and now those same commanders were unleashing a strategic bombing campaign that was systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war. Flying missions in daylight where Hartmann and his fellow pilots could see them coming and still could not stop them. Waves of fortresses that kept coming despite losses that would have broken any other air force. And in the following months, as Hartmann continued to fly and fight and somehow survive while younger pilots died on their first or second missions, as the American bomber streams grew larger and their fighter escorts grew more numerous, as German factories burned and cities crumbled and the fuel supplies dwindled so that training for new pilots became almost non-existent, he watched the Luftwaffe's qualitative superiority erode under the weight of American industrial production and tactical innovation, watched as fortress formations appeared over every major city in Germany with virtual impunity, their defensive boxes now perfected, to the point where attacking them had become nearly suicidal, their escort fighters so numerous and so well coordinated that German interceptors often couldn't even reach the bombers before being engaged and driven off, and Hartmann remembered that laugh from December 1943, remembered the contempt he had felt for those flying coffins. And he understood now that the real coffin had been his own arrogance, the assumption that German tactical superiority and aircraft performance would always prevail over American brute force and mass production, and he thought about all the other German pilots who had died believing the same lie, who had pressed attacks on fortress formations believing they were fighting an inferior enemy, when in reality they were fighting an enemy that learned quickly and adapted ruthlessly, that turned its weaknesses into strengths through organization and doctrine, that absorbed losses which would have destroyed the Luftwaffe 10 times over and kept coming back stronger. And now in early 1945, as Hartmann flew his increasingly rare sorties on diminishing fuel supplies, dodging through clouds of American fighters to occasionally glimpse the bomber formations flying overhead in perfect geometric precision like some vast industrial mechanism grinding Germany into dust, He realized that the Americans had won the air war not by building better aircraft but by refusing to accept that their aircraft couldn't win, by studying their failures and adapting their tactics, and above all by demonstrating a willingness to sustain losses that would have seemed unbearable to the Luftwaffe High Command, and those fortress crews who had kept flying through the devastating losses of 1943, who had climbed back into their flying coffins mission after mission when their statistical chances of completing a 25-mission tour were vanishingly small. Those men had not been fools or lambs to the slaughter but rather the instrument of a strategic vision that understood how to win a long war of attrition through industrial capacity and tactical adaptation, and the laugh that Hartmann had shared with his wingmen on that December morning had been the sound of men who did not yet understand that they had already lost, who could not conceive that their technical and tactical superiority in individual combat would prove meaningless against an enemy that fought at the strategic level, that transformed losses into data and data into improved tactics and improved tactics into an unstoppable campaign of aerial destruction. And now as Hartmann stood once again at the ready room window watching yet another formation of B-17's lumber overhead, untouchable behind their screen of escorts and overlapping gun positions, he thought about all the German pilots who had laughed at those flying coffins in the early days, who had racked up easy kills against unescorted and poorly organized American bombers, who had believed that the war would be won through individual heroism and superior aircraft performance, and he counted the empty chairs in the ready room, the places where his friends and comrades had sat before they too encountered the perfected fortress tactics or the long-range Mustangs or simply ran out of luck flying against an enemy that could replace its losses while Germany could not. And he wondered if the American crews ever laughed at the German fighters now, if they saw the diminishing number of interceptors rising to meet them and felt the same contempt that Hartmann had felt in 1943, but he suspected they did not laugh, that men who had endured the hell of combat over Germany in 1943 when fortress losses sometimes exceeded 25% per mission did not waste time on contempt, that they simply continued to fly and fight with the grim determination that characterized the American approach to war, that methodical willingness to sustain horrific losses while learning and adapting and ultimately overwhelming any opponent. Through sheer persistence and industrial capacity, and Hartmann thought about the irony that the flying coffins had become the instrument of German defeat, that those supposedly obsolete bombers had proven more effective than any wonder weapon the Reich's engineers could devise, that American crews dying in their hundreds over German cities in 1943 had paid the blood price necessary for their air force to learn how to wage strategic bombing warfare effectively, and now in 1945 those lessons had been perfected into a system of aerial warfare that Germany had no answer for, no counter to the endless waves of fortresses that appeared overhead day after day regardless of weather or German resistance. And as Hartmann walked slowly toward his Messerschmitt for what might be his last mission, he passed the maintenance shed where mechanics were cannibalizing 3 damaged fighters to keep one airworthy, and he thought again about that laugh from December 1943, about how quickly confidence had turned to desperation, about how the men who had mocked the flying coffins were now themselves fighting from a position of certain defeat, flying missions that could not change the war's outcome but continuing to fight anyway because that was what soldiers did. And he climbed into his cockpit and strapped himself in and started his engine, listening to it cough and sputter on the low-quality synthetic fuel that was all Germany could produce now, and he taxied out to the runway where he paused, for a moment looking up at the empty sky that would soon be filled with American bombers and their fighter escorts, and he remembered Werner's voice screaming over the radio on that December morning, remembered the sound of his wingmen dying because he had believed too completely in German superiority, because he had laughed at the flying coffins instead of respecting them, and Hartmann pushed his throttle forward and accelerated down the runway, lifting off into the cold spring air, climbing toward another formation of B-17s that gleamed in the afternoon sun like a vision of American industrial might made manifest. And he knew that this was how the war would end, not with dramatic battles or wonder weapons but with this slow grinding attrition, these waves of fortresses that kept coming regardless of cost. And he thought one final time about that laugh from December 1943, about how naive they had all been, and then he pushed all thoughts aside and focused on the geometry of the attack, on finding some angle that might let him damage even one bomber before the Mustangs found him, because whatever else had changed, he was still a fighter pilot, still trained to press the attack regardless of the odds. And as he closed with the bomber stream and the first tracer rounds began to arc toward his aircraft, Klaus Hartmann understood with perfect clarity that the men who had laughed at America's flying coffins had written their own epitaph in that laughter. had sealed their fate in that moment of contemptuous certainty, because they had failed to understand that wars are not won by the side with the best individual warriors or the most technically superior equipment, but by the side that learns fastest and adapts most ruthlessly and refuses most completely to accept defeat. And the Americans in their supposedly obsolete fortresses had demonstrated all three qualities in abundance, transforming a flawed weapons system into an engine of strategic victory through doctrine and determination and the willingness to pay whatever price was necessary. And now as Hartmann's fighter shuddered under the impact of 50 caliber rounds and his instruments began to fail and he felt the control stick go slack in his hands, now as he reached for the canopy release to bail out of his dying aircraft, he had time for one last thought about those flying coffins and the men who flew them, one final moment of understanding that the Americans had never needed to build perfect aircraft, that they had only needed to build adequate aircraft and then figure out how to use them properly. And that lesson, that simple, devastating lesson in the application of industrial warfare, had been written in fire across the skies of Germany by men who climbed into their supposedly obsolete bombers mission after mission and flew into hell and died by the thousands until their survivors learned how to fight effectively. And that was why Germany was burning now, why the Luftwaffe was broken, why Hartmann was falling through the sky with his parachute streaming above him, watching his Messerschmitt, his beautiful, technologically superior Messerschmitt, spiral earthward in flames while overhead the bomber formation continued on its way, barely noticing the loss of one more German fighter, and he thought as he drifted down toward the burning landscape of his homeland that perhaps the real joke had been on the Germans all along, that the flying coffins had been laughing at them the entire time, laughing with the grim persistence of American industrial power, laughing with the voices of men who refused to quit even when the odds seemed hopeless, laughing with the terrible inevitability of a nation that could absorb punishing losses and still keep fighting. And as Hartmann hit the ground and rolled and came to rest in a muddy field somewhere in what used to be Germany, he looked up at the sky where the contrails of the departed bombers still hung like accusatory fingers pointing toward the ruins of the Reich, and he understood finally and completely that the men who had laughed at those flying coffins had been laughing at their own doom, had been mocking the instrument of their own destruction, and the laugh had echoed back across the years to become something else entirely, had transformed into the sound of burning cities and falling aircraft. And 1,000 German pilots who had learned too late that contempt for your enemy is the first step toward defeat, and that the Americans in their ungainly fortresses had understood something fundamental that the Luftwaffe had not, had grasped that victory belongs not to those who start strongest but to those who learn fastest and persist longest. And that was the real lesson of the flying coffins, the truth that Klaus Hartmann finally understood as he lay in that muddy field watching the smoke rise from yet another burning German city, listening to the distant rumble of the fortress formations passing overhead on their way to the next target, knowing that tomorrow they would come again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until there was nothing left to bomb, nothing left to defend, nothing left but the memory of a laugh that had died in the throats of men who had not understood that they were mocking their own defeat.